Today I'm going to do the time and place tag, which was originally created by Jen Campbell, and I was tagged by Jean from Bookish Thoughts. For this tag you have to pick 10 books that you associate with a particular time or place in your life and talk about that association and also a tiny little bit about the books themselves. I haven't actually picked 10, I've picked 5, just because I couldn't really think of 10 that had a really strong connection for me. But this is definitely a tag that I'd like to do again when I've had more feelings, when I've been to more places and I've read even more books. I'm going to start with Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Northanger Abbey was the first classic I ever read, and it started me going on a journey of reading classic literature, and I wanted to read the books that everybody talked about, like the works of Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, and Northanger Abbey was the very start of that. And when I went to university, it was actually the first book I studied as a literature student. I just associate Northanger Abbey with me almost coming full circle, in the way that I was always a reader, but Northanger Abbey made me into the reader that I am, and when I went to university it was almost like that book started it off in a weird way, and now I'm studying it, so yeah. Northanger Abbey is centred around the character of Catherine Morland. It's really a story of Catherine growing up and learning to distinguish between fiction and reality. It's a really wonderful satire of Gothic literature. It explores the power of reading, and in fact, in Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen basically interrupts the narrative to talk about women's writing or women in fiction, and she really uses the form of the novel in a really magical way. A book that I always talk about, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I read Mrs. Dalloway when I was in Italy, and it was 40-degree heat in Tuscany, and I remember reading this novel and it just didn't suit the environment that I was in. Mrs. Dalloway is set in the middle of June in London, and even when Clarissa Dalloway kind of reminisces, she talks about how fresh, how calm, stiller than this of course, the air was in the early morning, like a flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave. Then recently when I went to London and I went to Bloomsbury, and it was the middle of June and I felt really connected to the novel. Both of those experiences made me realise how important an environment was when you're actually reading a novel, because it can really impact your response to it. Mrs. Dalloway is also in a way not only a place that I associated with, it is a time as well. Because reading Mrs. Dalloway for the second time, it was almost as if a light was being switched on somewhere. It made a profound impact on me and it influenced what I thought a novel was and what a novel was capable of doing. And in a similar way to Northanger Abbey, I read Mrs. Dalloway just before my A-levels, and now I'm writing my dissertation on it. So I feel like I've grown up quite a bit actually with this novel. I always find it really hard to actually describe what Mrs. Dalloway is about, because it's about so many things. And when you describe about Mrs. Dalloway that it's about a woman preparing for a party who goes and gets some flowers, walks around London, a man that she would love with visits her, there's a shell-shocked soldier. It all feels slightly disconnected, and it's about humanity. It's about loving someone, about regret. It's about the position of women in society. It's just a really beautiful novel. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Whenever I read Wuthering Heights, whenever I watch it, whenever I think about it, I think of the Yorkshire Moors. And every reader does, because Yorkshire Moors is such a character in this novel. And when I finally had the opportunity to go to the Yorkshire Moors, I was staying in a farm. I was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and I had this really beautiful old-fashioned window, and I remember sitting and reading Wuthering Heights and having this window wide open, and it was raining really heavily and we had thunder and lightning. I remember feeling the wind coming off the moors and being really connected to this novel, because you're experiencing something that the characters do. That's something I really like doing. I like being in an environment where a book is set or a film is set, because it's almost like those two worlds, kind of like in Catherine Morland's mind in Northanger Abbey, the lines between fiction and reality become blurred. Wuthering Heights is a kind of ghost story. It's about all-consuming, obsessive love, but love that's also kind of hate at the same time. It's very gothic, it's violent, it's about betrayal and envy, and it's also one of my favourite books. Just like I said about Wuthering Heights, when fiction and reality become slightly blurred because you're in that environment, that certainly happened to me when I was in Scotland and reading Outlander. The majority of places that are actually mentioned in this book I'd either had the opportunity to go to or would be near, so I was surrounded by the landscape that the book was talking about, which was really nice. I was actually listening to the audiobook. I was in a forest and the characters were also in the forest at this point in the story, And I actually remember kind of looking around and realising that the characters actually weren't there because the narrator puts on different voices, so I was kind of expecting them to be surrounding me. So there was no Jamie Fraser or Murta or Dougal Mackenzie. Outlander by Diana Gabaldon is a story that I absolutely devoured. It's about Claire, who is in a second honeymoon in Inverness with her husband Frank, and she goes to Craig na Dún's Standing Stone Circle, and she accidentally time travels to 1743. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. It's really exciting whenever you watch anything or read anything that is set somewhere that you know really well, because in a strange way you feel like an insider to this story. The first line of the novel begins, "Some years ago there was in the city of York a society of magicians." The text features York Minster, magic happens at York Minster. One of the characters stays in York in Lady Peckett's Yard, which is a really beautiful street that I love. The Society of Magicians meet in the Old Starter Inn. I also associate Jonathan Strange with a particular time in my life because I read this book after the end of my second semester, and I wasn't particularly happy after my second semester. And this book, because it's absolutely massive and I had a lot to think about with it because it's really detailed and in depth, really took me away from all those kind of negative thoughts that were in my mind at the time when I was reading it. It also made me fall in love with reading again. Not that I ever really fell out of love with reading, but when I was a little girl, like many of us I'm sure, I couldn't wait to go to bed to open my book and read. Then with the introduction of iPlayer and Netflix and having technology near me all the time, bedtime reading kind of disappeared, and instead I'd watch a TV programme or I'd watch a film. But for the last couple of years I've just yearned to go to bed with a book. I'm not really quite sure why. I think I wanted that enjoyment that I remember having as a child. I wanted to read until my eyes couldn't cope anymore and they just need to go to sleep. This is the book that has brought me back to that time in my life, and I am a lot happier for it. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is about two magicians who want to restore magic to England. It reads like a 19th century novel. People have said it's as if Dickens or Jane Austen did a fantasy book, and that is pretty spot on. To be honest, this book is pretty near perfection. This list has a lot of my favourite books on. Jonathan Strange is definitely one of my favourite novels. I think that's because when you really love a book, or when it's made a profound impact on you, like Mrs. Dalloway did on me, places that you remember reading this novel and you associate with it, and the times in your life really stay with you. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. It was really enjoyable to make because I like documenting my own personal experiences with reading, and I'd really be interested to hear what your selection of books would be. If you would like to make this video, please do. I tag you and just link Jen's channel in the description of your video.